It was a chilly Friday evening, and the streets outside the luxurious restaurant gleamed under the streetlights. The city was alive with the hum of traffic and the occasional laughter of pedestrians walking by, but inside the atmosphere was one of calm sophistication. The restaurant, known for its refined decor and exclusive clientele, had an almost regal feel. Its walls were adorned with expensive artwork, and the rich mahogany tables gleamed under the soft, warm lighting. The air was thick with the scent of gourmet food, the gentle clinking of glasses, and the soft murmur of polite conversation. For many, dining here was more than just a meal, it was an experience. The owner, Victor Harris, prided himself on offering a level of service that was unmatched, making sure that each guest felt like royalty. He built his reputation on his keen eye for detail, his impeccable taste in both food and decor, and most importantly, his ability to charm high-profile patrons. The restaurant had become a symbol of status, a place where the rich and powerful came to mingle and enjoy an evening of luxury. People often talked about the exclusivity of the place, how only the elite could get a reservation, and how Victor himself would greet you like a friend, as if you were among the few worthy of his attention. But that evening, the air inside the restaurant felt different. Victor stood behind the bar, surveying the room with a look of satisfaction. He was a tall man in his early 40s, with slicked back hair, sharp features, and a demeanor that suggested he was always in control. His eyes scanned the guests, making mental notes of who was ordering the most expensive wine, and who was seated at the best tables. It was all about appearances, about making sure the right people felt important. As the evening progressed, the door opened, and a woman walked in. Her entrance was graceful and confident, her black heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she made her way past the host stand. She was dressed in a sleek, dark-colored dress that hugged her figure perfectly, her curly hair pulled back into an elegant updo. Her presence was commanding, but not in an overly flashy way. There was something about her that made you stop and take notice, even if you couldn't quite put your finger on it. She had the air of someone who knew her worth. The host, a young man in a crisp black suit, greeted her with a warm smile. "Good evening, ma'am. Table for one, yes, please," she replied with a soft yet firm tone. Her voice carried an air of calm authority. She was escorted to a table near the window, a spot with a perfect view of the city's skyline. As she sat down, she took a moment to settle in, glancing around the room with a look of quiet appreciation. She had been to many upscale places like this before, but tonight was special. She had just received a promotion at work, something she had worked tirelessly for, and this dinner was a celebration of her own success. It wasn't about flaunting her achievements, but about taking a moment to savor the fruits of her labor. But what she didn't know as she settled into her seat was that the evening she had envisioned a peaceful celebration of her accomplishment was about to take a very different turn. Victor, who had noticed her the moment she entered, now turned his attention to the woman as she sat alone at the table. A smile crept across his face. To him, a solo diner wasn't just a customer, she was an opportunity. In his world, the way someone looked where they sat, how they dressed spoke volumes. And this woman, with her poised elegance and quiet confidence, didn't seem to belong in his world. He made his way over to her table, his steps purposeful, his smile one of practiced charm. As he approached, the woman looked up, meeting his gaze with a calm, composed expression. Her eyes didn't betray any hint of discomfort. She was already accustomed to the feeling of being underestimated. "Good evening, Madam," Victor said smoothly, his voice dripping with the kind of politeness that had been perfected over years of interacting with wealthy guests. "I trust everything is to your liking." The woman nodded, offering a polite smile. "Yes, everything is fine, thank you." Victor lingered for a moment, studying her with a keen gaze. She wasn't one of the regulars, that much was clear. He had seen enough faces pass through his doors to know when someone didn't quite fit. And in that moment he decided to test the waters, to see just how far he could push her. "You know," he continued, his voice casual but with an undertone of superiority. "I've seen many people come through this place, but I have to say, it's rare to see someone so out of place. This restaurant isn't exactly the kind of place where anyone can just walk in off the street." His smile widened, and his eyes glinted with a touch of condescension. The woman's face didn't change. She continued to look at him, her calm demeanor unshaken. But inside, something stirred. She knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't offering a genuine welcome, he was making an assumption based purely on the color of her skin and the fact that she had come alone. She wasn't here to prove herself to anyone, certainly not to him. But the way he spoke so smugly, so assured of his own superiority, made her feel like she was being reduced to nothing more than an outsider. And she was about to let him know that this evening, things wouldn't unfold as he expected. Victor's smile lingered for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the woman seated at the table. Her composed expression remained unchanged, but Victor wasn't used to people not reacting to him, especially in his own restaurant. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, to control the atmosphere around him with a few choice words. But something about her presence made him uneasy, and rather than dismiss it, he allowed his discomfort to fuel his next move. "Well, I must admit," Victor began, taking a step closer to her table, his tone growing more familiar, almost patronizing, "we don't often see people like you here. You're certainly not one of the regulars." His words, laced with subtle judgment, were meant to test her. There was a hint of amusement in his voice, but it was clear that the amusement was at her expense. In Victor's world, people like her, people who didn't fit into the narrow mold he had constructed in his mind, were anomalies, and anomalies were always worth scrutinizing. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just low enough to make sure only she could hear him. "I'm surprised you're able to afford such a luxury. To be honest," he continued, his eyes scanning her dress, her shoes, the simple yet elegant accessories she wore. He had already made up his mind that she didn't belong. She was out of place, a visitor in a world that didn't welcome her kind. The woman's face remained still, but her eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second, an imperceptible shift that might have been missed by anyone else. It was a look that said she had heard his words, that she understood the unspoken message behind them. Victor, however, did not pick up on this. His ego had already begun to cloud his judgment, and he pushed forward with his verbal assault, convinced that she would either apologize or, at the very least, shrink away. "People like you," Victor's voice trailed off, and he made a subtle gesture with his hand, as if to encompass her entire presence in the room. "Well, let's just say I don't think this is the kind of place you'd usually choose to dine in. I'm sure you'd be much more comfortable at a more casual spot, don't you think?" His words were meant to sting, to make her feel small, to put her in a position where she would feel obligated to justify her presence. He was testing her, but what he didn't know was that the woman had faced this type of prejudice before. Her calm demeanor wasn't a sign of discomfort, it was a sign of control. She knew exactly what he was doing, and she had no intention of giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Victor, however, was not one to be easily discouraged. Seeing that she didn't react as he expected, he took it a step further, allowing his words to grow even more venomous. "You know," he continued, his voice oozing with false sympathy, "it's just that places like this are reserved for people who appreciate the finer things in life, people who understand what it means to have class." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in, watching her every movement, as if he were a predator circling its prey. "I wonder," he said, leaning in even closer, "if you even know what you're supposed to order here." The woman's eyes met his, and for the first time she allowed a faint smile to appear on her lips. She didn't say a word, but her gaze told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't going to engage with him on his terms. Instead, she would remain silent, allowing him to dig his own hole deeper. Victor, however, was so wrapped up in his own arrogance that he didn't stop to consider the woman's reaction. His eyes moved from her face to the menu in front of her, as if to find further fault. "Perhaps you should start with something simple," he suggested, still playing the part of the gracious host, but his tone had turned mocking. "Something basic. Maybe a salad? Something light. You wouldn't want to embarrass yourself ordering something too extravagant, now would you?" The words hit their mark. They were meant to humiliate, to make her feel like an outsider, a person unworthy of the luxury that surrounded them both. Victor wasn't aware that his actions were slowly revealing his true character, that his racism was spilling out, poisoning the air between them. The woman paused, her gaze still fixed on him. She didn't flinch at his remarks, but her mind was already racing. She had heard it all before: the subtle slights, the underhanded comments, the assumptions that she didn't belong. But this was different. This wasn't just another incident of racism that she could shrug off. No, this was personal, and Victor had just made a mistake. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, as she reached for her purse, not to leave, but to pull out a small item, a thin, sleek business card that she placed carefully on the table. She didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at Victor, her eyes now filled with quiet confidence. Victor looked down at the card and then back up at her, clearly confused. His mind was still clouded with his assumptions, and he didn't see the significance of the card. It was just a business card to him, something unremarkable, something easily dismissed. But to the woman it was more than that. It was her identity, a glimpse into her world, and it was a key that would soon unlock a very different reality for Victor. She smiled again, but this time it wasn't a polite smile. It was a smile that carried weight, a smile that spoke of hidden power and unspoken truths. She had just decided that Victor was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The air in the restaurant grew heavier, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Victor stood there, eyes still locked on the woman at the table, his posture radiating an arrogance that seemed to echo through the room. Her calm, collected response had only fueled his pride. He couldn't fathom that she wasn't reacting the way he anticipated, either by retreating into silence or, at the very least, offering some form of apology. In his mind, she should be ashamed of herself for daring to dine in such an exclusive establishment. Instead, she remained poised, unruffled, even as he continued to undermine her at every opportunity. His gaze flickered down to the business card she had placed on the table, a momentary flash of confusion in his eyes. But instead of asking about it or acknowledging it, he chose to dismiss it after all. What did a simple business card matter when he had the power to control the environment? Still, something about her unshaken demeanor began to gnaw at him. He had tried to corner her, but she hadn't played into his hand, and that, more than anything, was starting to bother him. Victor's thoughts swirled with irritation, and the more he stood there, the more his annoyance grew. His previous charm had all but disappeared, replaced with the sharp, cutting edge of his entitlement. In his mind, the situation had gone too far. He wasn't just a restaurant owner anymore, he was someone who held the key to everything. This woman wanted a seat at a table in his exclusive restaurant. But she wasn't acting like she was grateful for the privilege. She wasn't showing the proper deference he expected, and that, in his mind, was an insult. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice, trying to assert some sort of dominance over her. "You know, there are plenty of people out there who'd be thrilled just to get a reservation here. They would be grateful for the opportunity to experience this place, this kind of luxury. But you," he said, his voice now dripping with disdain, "you seem to think you're entitled to it, don't you?" Victor watched her carefully, waiting for a response, hoping to catch a flicker of discomfort, a sign that she was affected by his words. But she simply looked at him with that same calm expression, her eyes never wavering. She didn't answer immediately, as if she was weighing how best to respond to his taunts. But in that silence, Victor's irritation deepened. "It's honestly shocking," he continued, his tone growing louder, more scornful. "You don't even belong in a place like this. A woman like you should know your place." He smirked, clearly feeling a false sense of superiority as he tried to push her into a corner with his words. "You really shouldn't be so bold. especially in front of people who truly belong here. A few patrons nearby, some of them regulars, turned their heads, sensing the tension in the air. They didn't know what had been said, but they could feel the shift in the room. The woman remained unperturbed, but Victor, ever the showman, wanted to make sure the people around them understood who was in control. He wasn't just humiliating her anymore, he was trying to prove something. He wanted the others to see how easily he could crush her, how small he could make her feel. She was an outsider, and he was the one who would remind her of that. But the woman's response, when it finally came, was unexpected. She leaned back slightly in her chair, folding her arms across her chest, her gaze still locked on Victor. "I don't think you understand who you're speaking to," she said, her voice soft but carrying an unmistakable edge. Victor's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "Oh, really? And who are you supposed to be exactly?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. He was certain now that she was either naive or completely unaware of the world she was in. "Just because you've put on a nice dress doesn't mean you're anything special here. You're just another person trying to play a part in a world that doesn't welcome you." The woman's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she reached for her bag, her movements deliberate and controlled. Victor's gaze followed her, wondering if she was about to leave in defeat. But instead, she pulled out a small leather wallet, from which she retrieved another item. The item wasn't another business card this time, it was a badge, small but unmistakably official. Victor's smirk faltered slightly as she placed it on the table in front of him. She didn't speak, only pushed the badge closer toward him. Victor's eyes flickered from the badge back to her face, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. He wasn't sure what he was looking at, but the woman's calm demeanor suddenly seemed less like a sign of submission and more like a warning. The silence that followed was thick with tension, as if time itself had paused in anticipation of what would happen next. He leaned in, his gaze still fixed on the badge, but his mind raced with possibilities. Could it be? Was she connected to someone important? His thoughts spun with confusion, disbelief, and the growing realization that maybe, just maybe, he had misjudged her completely. He looked up at her, trying to maintain control. "What is this?" he asked, his voice less confident than before. There was a tremor of uncertainty that betrayed the facade of authority he had so carefully crafted. The woman's response was a simple one, but it was enough to shift the entire dynamic. "I suggest you take a closer look," she said, her voice no longer quiet, but firm. "That badge isn't just for show. It belongs to someone who has a lot more power than you can imagine." Her tone was unyielding, and the words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Victor stared at the badge, a sickening realization beginning to settle in his gut. He had crossed a line, one he hadn't even seen coming, and the truth of who this woman was slowly beginning to dawn on him. But instead of retreating, Victor's pride pushed him further. He wasn't ready to admit defeat. "Not yet. And what exactly does that mean for me?" he sneered, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. The woman didn't respond immediately. She let his question linger, allowing the weight of the moment to build. She was no longer the subject of his mockery, she had become the force that would reshape the evening. Victor, for all his arrogance, had no idea that the woman sitting before him was about to turn everything he thought he knew on its head. The room, once filled with the hum of clinking glasses and the murmur of quiet conversation, had fallen eerily silent. The moment the woman had placed the badge on the table, everything seemed to shift. Victor, for the first time that evening, found himself struggling to maintain his usual composed, superior demeanor. The smug confidence that had once been his shield now seemed like a brittle mask, about to crack under the weight of a reality he hadn't prepared for. He stared at the badge on the table, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had thought he could break her down with words, humiliate her, make her feel inferior. He had been certain that the power dynamics of the restaurant, the subtle racism he had woven into his actions, would make her submit. But now, as he looked at the small, official badge that she had casually slid across the table, He felt something he had never felt in his years of running his high-end restaurant: uncertainty. The woman's unflappable calm, her silent yet undeniable power, was beginning to crack open his own confidence. Victor blinked, focusing on the badge again. It wasn't something he could ignore. The gleaming insignia on it was unmistakable. This was no ordinary piece of identification. It was a badge of authority. He felt a chill creep down his spine as he recognized it, a name he had heard in passing but never imagined would be in front of him. His eyes slowly lifted from the badge, and he saw the woman watching him with an intensity that made his throat go dry. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, laden with unspoken consequences. It was as if time itself had come to a halt. The restaurant, once vibrant with laughter and chatter, now seemed to be holding its breath, the tension palpable in the air. Victor felt his pulse quicken, his mouth suddenly dry as the weight of his previous words hung over him like a dark cloud. He forced a laugh, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Well, I guess it's nice to know you have connections," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it once had. It came out sounding weak, an attempt to salvage the situation that only deepened his discomfort. "But that doesn't change anything. You're still a guest in my restaurant, and you'll still need to follow the rules." But the woman didn't flinch. Her gaze didn't waver, and in that moment it was clear to Victor that she was no longer the victim of his mockery. She was something more, someone who had the power to upend his carefully constructed world with a single word. The silence was broken, not by her speaking, but by a movement at the door. Victor's head snapped around as a figure stepped into the room. It was a tall, imposing man, dressed in an official uniform, his expression stern and unwavering. His presence alone seemed to carry a weight that made the air even thicker. He moved toward the woman's table, his eyes briefly meeting hers before turning to Victor. "I need you to come with me, Mr. Victor," the man said, his voice calm but authoritative. Victor's heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize the man, but the way he addressed him with such certainty made it clear that he wasn't someone to be ignored. Victor tried to recover, still clinging to his belief that he was in control of the situation. He stood up, a little too quickly, as if the sudden rush of panic had caught him off guard. "What is this about?" he demanded, his voice now edged with annoyance. "I'm the owner of this establishment. I don't have time for Mr. Victor." "Now is not the time," the man interrupted, his tone unwavering. "Please, come with me. This is a matter of urgency." The realization hit Victor like a punch to the gut. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the situation. The woman hadn't been lying. The badge had been no empty threat. She had power, a power that extended far beyond his restaurant's walls. And that power had just walked through the door in the form of this man. Victor felt his legs tremble as the reality of his actions began to sink in. The woman, still seated at the table, didn't say a word. She simply watched as Victor's world unraveled in front of him. The smug restaurant owner, the man who had made her feel small and insignificant just moments ago, was now at the mercy of forces he couldn't control. His arrogance, his blatant racism, his refusal to recognize the humanity in others, all of it had led him here, to this very moment. Victor glanced back at her, his face pale, his mind racing for an escape. "What's going on?" he asked again, this time his voice softer, filled with uncertainty. "Who are you? What is this?" The woman finally spoke, her voice low but firm. "I think you know exactly who I am now," she said, her eyes cold and unwavering. "And I think you've just learned a valuable lesson. You don't get to treat people like that, not in my presence, not in my world." The man in uniform stepped forward, placing a hand on Victor's shoulder, his grip firm. "Mr. Victor, it's time to go," he said, the words carrying the weight of an inevitable fate. Victor's eyes darted around the room, his mind still struggling to comprehend what was happening. The other patrons were now watching, some with curious glances, others with open judgment. The murmurs of conversation had died down completely, and all that was left was the sound of Victor's frantic breathing. He had made a mistake, one that he couldn't undo. He had tried to humiliate the wrong person, and now it was his turn to face the consequences. He stood there for a moment, frozen in place, his mind reeling. The power he had once wielded so confidently in his restaurant, where he controlled every detail, every interaction, was now slipping through his fingers. The woman, calm and composed, had already won. The karma he had so richly earned was unfolding right before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The man in uniform motioned toward the door again, and Victor, defeated, finally stepped forward. The air seemed to grow even heavier as he walked toward the exit, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with every step. He had humiliated her, treated her like she didn't matter, and now he was the one being escorted out. As Victor stepped outside into the cold night, he could hear the faint sound of applause from inside the restaurant. The woman had won not just her personal victory, but a victory over the arrogance and cruelty that had driven Victor to belittle her. And in that moment, as the door closed behind him, Victor knew that he would never forget the lesson he had just learned. No one was immune to karma, and sometimes the ones you choose to humiliate are the ones who have the last word. Victor stood there in the cold, the icy night air hitting his face with a force that only deepened his sense of shock. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, heavier than any of the failures or challenges he had ever faced in his life. His heart pounded in his chest, not from the cold, but from the burning realization of how quickly his world had crumbled. Just moments ago, he had been in control, the master of his domain, the proud owner of a successful restaurant where nothing and no one could challenge him. But now, all of that seemed so distant, so fragile, as if it had never truly been real. As he stood there on the sidewalk, the restaurant door slowly swung shut behind him, cutting off the last vestiges of warmth and light. The patrons inside, the ones who had once quietly observed the unfolding drama, were now mere shadows to him. His eyes, wild and searching, flicked around, but there was no escape from what had just transpired. He was left to face a reality that seemed far more brutal than any criticism or failure he had encountered before. The uniformed man, still standing next to him, gave a slight nod, as if confirming something Victor had already known. Deep down there was no going back, no escape. The twisting knot of anxiety in his stomach grew tighter with every second, but the worst was yet to come. And then, the twist came. Victor's thoughts were scattered as he stood there, mentally running through all the possible scenarios he could have gotten himself into. His mind raced through a dozen ideas, trying to latch onto anything that could explain what was happening. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe the woman was an undercover investigator of some kind. Or maybe it was all just an elaborate setup to embarrass him, an elaborate scheme to get revenge for what he had done. But none of that made sense. The situation felt too real, too raw, and too precise. He turned to face the man who had escorted him out, his voice hoarse as he asked, "What exactly is going on here? Who is she?" The man looked at him, his expression unreadable. "You should have known better, Mr. Victor," he said, his voice matter of fact, but tinged with something deeper, something Victor couldn't quite place. "But now, I think it's time you understand the whole picture." Victor blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" he demanded, his frustration growing with each passing second. "I'm the one who's been wronged here. I run a legitimate business. I don't know who she is or what she's trying to do, but I'll make sure she pays for this. You can't just—" The man cut him off, his gaze hardening. "You still don't get it, do you? She didn't do anything wrong. You did. And now you'll face the consequences of your actions." Victor's mind reeled, the pieces not fitting together. He took a step back, trying to process the words. "What are you talking about?" His voice cracked slightly, and he could feel the first tinges of fear creeping in. This wasn't a game anymore. It wasn't some petty squabble that could be resolved with a few harsh words and threats. Something much bigger was at play, and he had been too blind to see it. The man didn't speak immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small and unassuming, just a card, plain and simple. He handed it to Victor, and as Victor took it, The light from the street lamp illuminated the bold letters printed on the front, FBI. The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. The realization struck with such force that Victor nearly dropped the card. His legs wobbled for a moment, and he staggered back against the restaurant's exterior wall, his mind racing. He couldn't have heard that right. This had to be some kind of mistake, a sick joke. The woman he had humiliated and belittled was somehow connected to the FBI. But how? Why? The pieces still didn't make sense, and the shock of the situation left him speechless. Her name, the man continued, is Agent Williams. She's been investigating your restaurant for quite some time. Not because of anything trivial, mind you. No, it's far worse than that. Victor's pulse quickened. The ground beneath him seemed to shift. His thoughts, scattered and disjointed, were struggling to catch up to the unfolding reality. The woman Agent Williams had been watching him for much longer than he realized. He had thought her calm demeanor was just a front, that she was simply trying to weather the humiliation he had subjected her to. But now, with the revelation of her true identity, everything shifted. This was no ordinary guest, this was someone who could destroy him with a single phone call. "Wait," Victor stammered, his words faltering. "You're telling me she was undercover?" The man nodded slowly. "Undercover, yes. But not just that. She's been investigating you for months, your practices, your business dealings, the way you've treated employees, customers, even people like her, the way you've built your empire on the backs of others. This wasn't just a random act of revenge, Victor. This was the culmination of a much bigger plan." Victor felt the ground shift beneath him again, this time for real. His knees buckled and he slumped back against the wall for support. His entire world, everything he thought he knew about power, control, and business, had just been turned upside down. It wasn't just about one bad moment, one poor choice of words. This was bigger. This was an intricate web of lies, manipulation, and abuse that had finally caught up with him. The man's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "You've been on their radar for a long time. This isn't just about your restaurant, it's about everything you've done, the people you've hurt. And now, the time has come to pay the price." Victor opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His mind was racing, a whirlwind of confusion, regret, and fear. How had he not seen it? How had he not realized the woman sitting across from him was far more than just a guest? She was a force that had been silently watching, waiting, planning. And now the truth was out. The twist that had unfolded was one he could never have predicted. The woman he had humiliated, belittled, and degraded was a federal agent, and not just any agent, but one who had been closing in on him for far longer than he had ever imagined. And now, as he stood there in the cold night, the consequences of his actions were more real than ever. Victor had thought he could get away with it all. But he had underestimated not just her, but the system she represented. He had underestimated karma, and now, the revelation of her true identity had sealed his fate. Victor's mind reeled as the man's words settled over him like a heavy blanket of cold reality. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to manipulate his surroundings and bend people to his will. It was how he had risen to the top in the competitive world of fine dining, how he had built his restaurant into a place of prestige, a place where power and wealth were not just admired but expected. He had never once thought that someone would be able to turn the tables on him, much less someone like her, the woman he had so carelessly insulted and humiliated. But now, standing in the darkness outside his restaurant, he realized just how wrong he had been. The man, the one who had revealed Agent Williams's true identity, stood silently beside him, watching as Victor absorbed the gravity of the situation. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk, adding to the surreal atmosphere. It felt as though the world had suddenly stopped moving, leaving him frozen in place, staring at a future that seemed bleak and inescapable. It wasn't just the FBI investigating his actions, it was his entire life, his empire, that was now on the line. As he stood there, speechless, the weight of his actions began to settle on his shoulders. He had been cruel to her, dismissive and arrogant. He had assumed that, because of his status and wealth, no one would dare stand up to him. But Agent Williams had done more than just stand up to him. She had dismantled the very foundation of his arrogance in one swift blow. And now, as if that wasn't enough, he was faced with the very real consequences of his behavior. Victor's thoughts flashed to the restaurant, to the staff and patrons inside, to the reputation he had worked so hard to build. All of it, every little bit, was now hanging in the balance. His employees, the ones who had always been at his mercy, would no longer be so easily manipulated. The customers who had once looked up to him, who had respected his authority, would now see him for what he truly was, a man who had been living in a bubble of privilege and self-delusion. And the worst part, it had all come crashing down so quickly that he hadn't even seen it coming. His stomach churned as he thought about what was to come. The FBI would be relentless, the investigation would be thorough, and the consequences, the consequences would be severe. His mind raced with the possibilities. Could he spin this? Could he smooth it over, maybe pay off a few people, use his wealth and influence to keep himself out of prison? No, he realized with a jolt. This wasn't something money could fix. The law was coming for him, and there was nowhere to hide. The man beside him, sensing his desperation, finally spoke again. You should have thought about this before you decided to treat people the way you did. It's too late for apologies now. The investigation is already in motion. And as for your restaurant, he let the words hang in the air. Victor's heart skipped a beat. He had always viewed his restaurant as an extension of himself, his success, his identity. To lose it was unthinkable. The thought of seeing it shut down, of watching everything he had worked for crumble into dust, made his chest tighten with panic. You can't do this, he stammered, his voice trembling for the first time in a long while. You don't know who I am. I'll make this right. I'll fix it. You have to give me a chance. But the man's expression remained unchanged, his gaze cold and distant. There's nothing to fix, Victor. It's already done. The damage you've caused, the people you've hurt, there's no coming back from that. The law will take its course, and you'll face the consequences of your actions. Victor's knees buckled as the full weight of his downfall hit him. The street beneath him felt as though it were sinking, and for a moment he feared he might lose his balance and collapse into the gutter. His hands trembled, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. This was real. This was happening, and there was no escape. A siren wailed in the distance, a reminder that the world had already begun to move forward without him. The law, the very thing he had thought he could control, was now catching up with him, and for the first time in his life, Victor felt completely powerless. He had never truly understood what it meant to be vulnerable, to be on the receiving end of the kind of treatment he had so often inflicted on others. But now he was about to experience it in full force. The man stepped back, his face hard and unyielding. I suggest you get your affairs in order, Victor. The next step is out of your hands. Victor swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He wanted to protest, to fight back, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? How could he argue with something so final, so absolute? The walls he had built around himself were crumbling piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The fallout from this moment of reckoning would reach far beyond his restaurant. His reputation, his wealth, his very identity, everything he had worked so hard to build was about to be obliterated. And then, as if to punctuate the finality of it all, the man turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Victor alone in the cold night. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, leaving Victor standing there staring into the abyss of his own making. Victor was left in the stillness, his body frozen as he tried to process the enormity of what had just happened. His empire, once so solid, was now in ruins. The karma that had been slowly gathering, silently creeping up behind him, had finally caught up with him in the most brutal way possible. He felt a bitter taste in his mouth, a taste of regret, of humiliation, and of guilt. He had been so sure of his invincibility, so certain that his wealth and power could shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now, it was all gone. The restaurant, the respect, the control, it was all slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Victor had received the immediate karma he so richly deserved, and as he stood there, the reality of his fall from grace settled in. There would be no coming back from this. As the days passed, the weight of Victor's downfall began to sink in more deeply, an unshakable reality that he couldn't escape. His restaurant, once the crown jewel of his career, had been closed for good. The patrons, who had filled the tables and fawned over his culinary masterpieces, now whispered about his disgrace. The employees, once loyal to him out of fear and respect, were now talking about him with disdain. Even those he had considered friends seemed to disappear, leaving him isolated in the wreckage of his past decisions. Victor had been a man who believed that power came with privilege. He had grown accustomed to the idea that he could do whatever he pleased, that the people around him were merely pawns in a game he controlled. To him, kindness and humility had always seemed like weaknesses, attributes reserved for those who couldn't rise to the heights he had. He thought his wealth, his influence, and his connections could shield him from the consequences of his actions. He never once imagined that one simple encounter with the wrong person would bring it all crashing down. Agent Williams, the woman he had insulted so callously, had been a force of justice that he hadn't seen coming. She had been unassuming, just another customer in his eyes, someone he could belittle without any repercussions. But what he failed to realize was that people are not defined by their outward appearance or their current position. She wasn't just a woman he could dismiss with a glance. She was a protector of justice, a person whose quiet strength and integrity were far more powerful than any wealth he could amass. He had wronged her in a way that was unforgivable, but it wasn't just her who was watching. His actions had affected everyone who had ever been on the receiving end of his arrogance, his cruelty, and his lack of compassion. The lessons that Victor was learning were harsh ones, and they were coming at a price he could never pay. Karma, as it often does, had found its way to him. It wasn't the immediate consequences of his actions, the investigations, the fines, the legal battles that struck him the hardest. It was the reflection on his own character, or rather the lack of it. He realized now how much of his success had been built on the backs of others, how much he had trampled on those who were weaker, those who didn't have the means to fight back. It was a sobering realization that brought with it a deep, gnawing emptiness. Victor had spent his life building an empire that was entirely based on power. But what he had failed to see was that true power wasn't about money, status, or control over others. Real power came from within, from the ability to treat others with respect, dignity, and kindness. Real power was the ability to build people up, not tear them down. The very things he had dismissed as weaknesses were the virtues that held true strength. Sitting alone in his apartment, his once pristine dining room now feeling like a distant memory of his former life, Victor had time to reflect. He thought about all the people he had wronged over the years. The ones he had bullied into submission, the ones he had ignored or dismissed because they didn't matter to him. He thought about the faces of his employees who had worked tirelessly for him, who had believed in him, and how he had taken them for granted. He thought about the patrons who had once praised him, who had enjoyed the luxury of his fine dining experience, only to have their respect for him evaporate the moment they saw the man behind the curtain, the arrogant, cold-hearted individual who had built his empire on the suffering of others. Victor realized that success built on the exploitation of others was hollow. It was fragile. It could be shattered in an instant, as it had been for him. His fall from grace was the result of a lifetime of bad choices, a reflection of a man who had never taken the time to truly understand the people around him, to show empathy, or to care about anything other than his own advancement. And now everything he had worked for was gone. The restaurant was closed, the staff were gone, and the customers who had once filled his dining room with their laughter and chatter had moved on. But even in the midst of his regret, something had shifted inside of him. It was a quiet understanding, a slow acceptance that he could not change the past, but perhaps he could learn from it. Victor had spent so long building his reputation, his wealth, and his status pursuits that had been empty at their core. He had missed out on the things that truly mattered: the relationships, the connections, and the respect of those around him. He had treated people like commodities, using them to elevate himself, never considering the toll it took on their lives. As he reflected on the consequences of his actions, Victor understood the deeper lesson he had been forced to learn. He had been given a second chance, albeit a painful one, and it was up to him whether or not he would rise from the ashes of his own downfall. He couldn't change the damage he had done to others, but he could change the man he had been. He could stop hiding behind the mask of arrogance and ego and begin to rebuild his life with humility and respect for the people around him. Victor knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The consequences of his actions were severe, and there would be no way to undo the damage he had caused. But he had learned the hard way that true power comes not from control, but from compassion. And maybe, just maybe, if he could find a way to show kindness and understanding to others, he might be able to rebuild something real: a life, a legacy, and perhaps even some measure of redemption. The fall had been swift and brutal, but Victor realized that it was not the end. It was the beginning of something new. A chance to redefine himself, to make amends, and to learn the greatest lesson of all: that kindness, humility, and respect were not weaknesses, but the very foundation of true strength.